There is bread, bigger than your head in the store, in the store. There is bread, just like lumps of lead in the quartermaster's store. My eyes are dim, I cannot see, I have no...
More food than she knew. With many miserable miles behind her and no money in her pocket, she did not like this feeling of being poor. With her family, she had travelled to the side of this clear, calm French lake in the mountains. She had a hope locked inside of her heart that they would all be safe and as far from the war as they could be. The summer's afternoon sun was rising in the sky, 2 years after the war had begun. Perhaps, she thought, the sun couldn't see this war below it, or it would have hidden its face behind the clouds until this madness has ended. Each weary footstep of the journey here had caked more mud upon her skin, and the sight of this water in front of her made her forget that she was a refugee from the city and the sound of guns and bombs. She was woken from her dismal thoughts by the sound of the rain falling on the lake. Perhaps the sun had heard her thoughts, and was hiding its shameful face behind the small summer clouds above. The rain was splashing on the surface of the lake, and it seemed to be boiling and bubbling, calling to her. She could feel this calming rain soaking into what was left of her ragged, best dress. Her mother and father had given her strict instructions as to where she could and could not go. She could hear her father's deep voice inside of her head. "Do not go too far away from the rest of us." She had nodded. "If you see something strange, do not make a noise. Hide and we will find you." She nodded again. But now, ignoring everything that she had been told, she found herself swimming in the water of the lake. She did not mind that it was filled with the last of the winter meltwater, and anyway, what difference does it make? The soldiers are far away. They won't bother with this piece of land so far away from the cities. She also comforted herself with the thought that she was getting wet anyway in the rain, so why not swim? She was a good swimmer, a strong swimmer, and this was an opportunity too good to refuse. If nothing else, it was the first chance that she had had to take a wash. When she stood on the bank and dried herself as best as she could with the tatters of her dress, she felt the way she had done before the war had started. She felt clean and happy and almost without care. It was, as she stood there, her skin still prickling from the icicle-cold water, that she took a great lungful of air and could smell food. Fine sausages, fat sausages, fine, round, fat, juicy sausages. This was something that she had not known these 2 long, hungry years. She had already defied her parents by going away from them and the rest of her family, so what difference would it make if she were to go and see where there could be the chance of food? She could not stop herself. It was as if the smell would drive her mad if she did not find out where it was being cooked. Just to see them would be enough, she lied to herself. She knew she was not going to be satisfied until she had them on a plate in front of her. She was clean, she was poor, she was tired. But most of all, she was a hungry refugee and desperate to have something to eat, and the smell of the food drew her further away from her family. Sneaking like a snake, she crept between the tall trees that lined the side of the lake. Stumbling at first, she made sure that she did not make a sound on all of the leaf litter and twigs that lay on the ground. And it was then that she saw them. A small brigade of men, soldiers, hiding in amongst the trees. They looked almost as dirty as she did. They looked tired and weary, but at least they had food. Her father had told her about the traps and tripwires that hunters and soldiers would lay to catch and kill unsuspecting animals and curious young girls. When she saw it, she forgot about all of her nodding at her father's stern warnings, and she screamed like a wounded animal. It was a wire, a thin, colourless wire, buried in the dead leaves, and it was attached to a grenade's pin, ready to kill these soldiers so far away from home, and she had almost stepped through it. Her heart was beating, and she thought of all of the consequences, all of the what-ifs, and what could have happened if she had taken just one more step. The searing noise of a screaming that split the silence was noticed by the sentry, who had been temporarily distracted by the thought of food. His gun was drawn and ready to take the enemy down with a single shot. His trigger finger was ready, and it was only his training, only his iron-willed discipline, that stopped him from shooting her where she stood. She had been trying to get closer to the food, and now she was raising her hands and looking down at her feet. He barked at her. "Who are you? Friend or foe?" She wanted to say that she did not understand. She did not know if he were German or English, Canadian or Belgian. All she knew was that he was not French. She really didn't care where he came from. She just knew that she did not want them to get hurt. "Who are you? Friend or foe?" His voice had calmed a little. With tears streaming down her face, she stammered, "Attention! Attention, monsieur! Attention, monsieur! Grenade!" With the tip of his pistol, he indicated that she should step back carefully. "Lower your hands, missy." She did not know what he was saying, so he lowered his gun. "Lower your hands, missy, and walk backwards the way you came." He had holstered his gun and was using his hands and pointing. "That's it. Good and slow. And we'll get you away from this little bit of a German grenade." The noise had made the rest of the men look towards them and start to move away from the cooking fire and the food. The sentry shouted over his shoulder to them, "It's all right. It's just a girl who got a bit lost." Dominique shrugged her shoulders and showed that she had no idea what he was saying, but his voice was as calming as the lake's gentle lapping behind her. The tallest of all of the men, with an officer's cap and bearing, took in the situation in a single glance. His voice was filled with kindliness and nobility. "You're a good girl. You've saved us all." She still had no idea what he was saying. All of the men were gathering around, pointing at the tripwire, the grenade, and her. She wished that she had listened to her father and had not wandered off, but the officer spoke again. "These are dangerous times, and we are grateful for your help, little lady." He shouted over his shoulder for someone to disarm the grenade and replace the pin. "What can we give you as a reward?" She still looked at him. His face seemed to screw up in pain as he tried to recollect the few smatterings of French he still had. He pointed at her. "Vous?" She nodded. "A present. Un cadeau." She nodded again. All the while the men were watching, and one of them could see that Dominique was staring towards their fire and the sausages. The men all started to rub their bellies and pretend that they were eating food. "Sir, I think she's hungry." The officer looked at her again. He had had enough time to trawl his memory for his schoolboy French. "Would you? Voulez-vous un cadeau?" "Well, would you believe it? She wants our bleeding sausages." Dominique was feeling bolder now, and there is not much difference between the English sausages and the French saucisses. She was really animated now. "Oui, oui, oui!" She was pointing at the frying pan. "Les saucisses! Les saucisses, s'il vous plaît!" "Men, give her all the food she wants. Better for us to be hungry than dead. This girl is our saviour." The officer was laughing now, and the men were all clapping her on the back and shaking her hand. They gave her more food than the whole of her family had eaten in 3 months. Enough for the whole of her family, father, mother, sister, and brother. When she lived after the Great War, she would always tell her children and her children's children how she had saved some English soldiers by the side of a lake where the water was so clear, and all because of some sausages.
And with the lice in the quartermaster's store, my eyes are dim, I cannot see. I have not brought my specs with me. I have not brought my specs with me. Paddy wrote a letter to his Irish Molly, oh, sure he'd not receive it, write and let me know. If I make mistakes in spelling, Molly dear, said he,
A moving image.
Remember it's the pen.
On a cold winter's morning, this young woman was sitting by the side of her mother's blazing coal fire. She was thinking about her sweetheart and how they had been to the cinema just last night, and how they had both laughed at the antics of Charlie Chaplin. She grinned to herself as she remembered how he had waddled, danced, and spun with an imaginary cane in his strong hands to keep her from thinking about him going away to war. Even now, as dawn was a memory, she knew that he would be far away from her and on his way to Flanders. In the heart of the Irish countryside, she knew that life would have to go on, and she would only try to think the best for herself and her soldier boy. One last time she conjured up the way that they had huddled together under an old woolen blanket on the hard, cold wooden benches to keep themselves warm. With Charlie Chaplin dancing on the flickering screen, he had promised that he would see her again, and they would be together in the cinema once more. The seasons moved on, and she could not believe her luck when the postman brought her letter. Expecting nothing but the worst of news, she chuckled when she read his beautifully neat copperplate handwriting about the pen being at fault if there are any spelling mistakes. She had been expecting tales of the war in France, but he had been stationed and billeted in London. He wrote that London was beautiful in its own way, but it could never match Tipperary, and how they would be back together again. He had finished his cheerful letter with the words, "My heart is with you in Tipperary. I'll see you there when I return from the war." She held this letter in her hands and kept it close to her heart every day, just waiting for another letter to fall through her letterbox. With no more letters to follow, she knew that no news was better than the telegram that would come that started with, "We regret to inform you." And still she waited for this war to end all wars, to bring her soldier boy back to her. It was not over by that first Christmas, and the weeks turned to years, and the years went on forever, and she held that blanket dear as it still held him inside of it, always waiting for a letter to let her know where he was. Every day she imagined him back on the farm, coming in from feeding the pigs or mowing the hay, standing in the doorway, handsome, strong, and hers. In her dreams he would look out from the doorway and be proud of the way she had taken care of the farm for him while he was away. She could hear him talk about how they would expand the fields and grow old together on their farm. In 1918, newsreels would be shown in the cinema of how the soldiers were steadily winning the war. She could feel her own anticipation of him returning soon, rising with each passing day. But she waited, and she waited. Other men had returned from the front and assured her that they had seen him on a train station or at a barracks, and he would be there in just a matter of days. To distract herself and stop her fretting about his delay, she went to the cinema alone, and when the newsreel came on, she saw him. She was shocked to see him there on the moving screen. The captions between the moving pictures spoke of the heavy fighting that had gone on to help bring this war to an end. Her soldier boy, her sweetheart, was in the middle of the battlefield helping to fight the retreating German army. At this resting camp, before they went back to fighting one of the most desperate battles of the whole war, he was smiling and smoking, looking straight into the camera. He did that silly Charlie Chaplin walk, waving an imaginary cane and making the rest of the soldiers laugh, the one he had done so many years before, just for her. He waved to the camera, and without thinking, she waved back at him, as if he were really there. But you could see that the movie was from August of 1918, and now it was nearly 1919. She did not need the telegram to tell her what had happened to a soldier boy. Every day, for a week, a fortnight, a month, she would go to the cinema to watch the newsreel and wave to him by the flickering light of the cinema screen.
It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. That's the wrong way to Tipperary. That's the wrong way to kiss. Don't you know that over here?
A boy's face on a hero's chest. His father's gun had always felt good in his hands, even though he was a small boy. He knew the feel of the wooden stock at his shoulder and the familiar, well-oiled smell of this gun until he began to think of it as his own. It was his greatest friend, and he had practiced every day to improve his aim and accuracy. Ever since he had been 8 years old, it had been his job to shoot and scare off the crows from his father's farm. At first, it had been the noise that the rifle made that had scared them away, but now he could line up their greedy black carcasses on the fence to warn away any other birds who wanted to steal food and seed from the land. With every waking moment, he wanted to be older and do his bit for king and country. It was all that the other farm boys talked about, joining up and showing the Boche a thing or two. At night, when he sat sighing into the reflection of the fire in the grate, his grandmother had told him that he would be glad of looking younger than he was, and to enjoy good looks while you've got them. He had been to the recruiting office twice now, and each time they had told him to come back when he had some whiskers on his chin and looked like a man. It wasn't fair, he muttered under his breath as he watched another jackdaw fall noiselessly down to the ground. He knew that young men 2 years younger than him had been accepted for the army, and all because they could grow a beard on their chin. If nothing else, he knew that Kitchener wanted men who could fire well, quickly, and with precision. He knew that they were having trouble with the newfangled machine guns. They were expensive, water-cooled, and always jamming. Kitchener had told the nation that they were going back to good old-fashioned marksmanship. He knew the satisfying kick of the rifle stock as the shot rang out across the dry, new-ploughed fields as he had ended another rook's life. There's no one for miles around who can shoot better than me. It was true, but he did not brag or boast or shout about it. It was just a plain fact that he could do more with a cheap, reliable rifle than many men could do with a useless machine gun. At the end of this summer's day, he had taken one of his sister's wigs and had cut some of the hair from it. It had taken him hours with scissors and glue and constantly staring at himself in the small army mirror of his grandfather to make it look like a convincing moustache. To be honest, in the darkness of his room and by the light of a reflected candle's light, it did look like a silky, mature growth on his upper lip. "I'll show them that I'm a man," he had said out loud as he lay down to sleep, and rubbed his fingers through the soft bristles on his lip. Tomorrow morning, before the rest of the family got up, he was going to go to the recruiting office and become a rifleman for the king. His father had forbidden him to go and join up, as he was needed for the farm. "The army needs food as much as it needs soldiers," his father had said. But here he was in the long queue of hopeful, willing men and boys. The bluff recruiting sergeant had moved up the line and stared at them one by one. He stamped his feet to attention when he stood beside him, Bill Salt. "You boy?" He placed his face too close to his own and raised his chin with his swagger stick. He looked him straight in the eyes. "How do you think you're going to defeat the Kaiser when you can't even grow a bit of fluff on your upper lip?" Here the sergeant grabbed hold of the wig hair and painfully tore it, glue, skin and all, from his lip. The other hopeful recruits all laughed, secretly glad that they were not being humiliated like this. Bill knew for a fact that many of them, at least half of them, were not the age that they pretended to be. The congealing lump of hair was waved in front of his face. "So, me laddie, it ain't even the same bleeding colour as the hair on your head." Bill had a taste of blood from the torn skin, but he was not going to shed a tear or let this bully know that he had hurt more than his pride. "Just give us a chance. The Kaiser doesn't care how old I am, so neither should you." No one had spoken to the sergeant like this in a long time. "So, we've got a feisty one here." Before he had a chance to continue, Bill shouted, "I bet I can shoot better than anyone. I bet I can shoot better than you. Just give me a chance, I'll show you." He paused, as all eyes were fixed on him. "And what is it that you will wager with me?" It was the sergeant's turn to take his time and enjoy the admiration of this growing audience crowding around them. Bill thought about what he wanted more than anything in this life. "If I beat you, then I will be allowed to join up. And if I win, what do I get?" The sergeant was remembering all of the sharpshooting trophies and medals in the barracks that had his name inscribed on them. "So, hairless wonder, what do I get if I beat you?" The metallic taste of dried blood was on his tongue now, and there was a fire in his belly. "If you beat me, then I will never try to join up again. I will continue to work on the farm and never dream of an army life ever again." The sergeant raised one eyebrow and thought that this was fighting talk, and there was an air of admiration in his voice. "Fair do, me shaved chicken. Let's see how good you are." They both spat into their hands and shook on this bet. At the back of the crowd, one man was running a book on who was going to win, and if Bill could have seen this, he would have known that the smart money was not on him. In a field beside the recruiting office, it was decided that the best of 3 shots would be the decider. Each of them, boy and man, tried their best, but it was Bill who beat the sergeant. The bookies loved him, as they had made enough money to buy themselves a good bottle of whiskey for the trenches. The sergeant knew graceful defeat, but was filled with pride for this Bill Salt, who had gone from foolish boy to a hero in front of the rest of the men. The sergeant turned to them all and shook Bill's hand. "We'll make a man of this boy. This is what the King's army needs. Watch out, Kaiser Wilhelm. Which of you horrible lot wants to be next?" There was a great crowding at the door of the office as they all clamoured to join first. That had all been 2 years ago. After going through all of his training, Bill had been singled out to be a sniper. He was at one with a gun from his very first day, but he had been held back and kept from the fighting. He had been placed on the covers of recruiting posters, used as a model for what the army needed, and had been kept away from the trenches so that he could have his photograph taken for winning another medal for his skill as a marksman. To show that he was a man, he had grown a moustache that was as full and waxed as Lord Kitchener's. It had not been easy at first, but he persevered and was proud of the way that he looked. He would pamper and wash and treat this great bush at his lip, and often smile to think of that poor attempt that he had tried at the recruiting office. When he was eventually posted, he was not placed at the front. He had been made to guard the ships and the port. He had his own place in a thick-leafed tree by the docks, and he knew the other men thought that he was given a cushy job just because he could shoot at targets. He could see the other men being transported to the front. They were upset and terrified, tall and determined, and envious of him. What they did not know was that he would have given anything to be going with them. On his days off, the women of the town had made a great fuss of him. They laughed when he tried to kiss them with his great moustache. They would giggle as he came close to them. "We do not like those, how you call them, those mouse catchers, as you call them. Shave it off, and we will think about giving you a kiss." They would laugh as they told him, "Shave it, dummy, and we will kiss your smooth lips." It had taken him so long to grow that he did not want to get rid of his mouse catcher too soon. Things in the war had changed, and not for the better. Within months, those same men were returning, retreating through the town, the port of Dunkirk. They did not think that his job was so cushy now. They knew that he would have to fight to the last man so that they could return to Blighty, to England, to live to fight another day. They knew what it was to fight, and they knew that the Germans wanted to make a big push and get the British to retreat. Thousands of them went past him waving him goodbye and good luck. After they had gone, there was a silence, and he thought that this would be the time for him to get rid of this moustache for once and for all. He had tasted and tried so many different things since he'd been in France. Sweet red wine, succulent meat, and the crumbling pastries that the women of the town would make for the soldiers. But he had never been kissed. "At least one kiss before I die is better than nothing." This was the first time that he had ever shaven, and hidden in the depths of the tree, with trembling fingers, he raised the cutthroat razor to his face and stared at his reflection in his grandfather's army mirror that had seen more action than him. It was not an easy job, but he could still see the scars that had been left by the ripping of his false moustache on his lip. As he brought this task to an end, with his hands still trembling, the mirror slipped from his fingers. It rolled to the ground and flashed in the sunlight. If he had shouted at the top of his voice, he could not have given the Germans more of a clue as to where they were. In less than a heartbeat, the tree seemed to be exploding and splintering about him as it was ripped with bullets. He dropped to the ground and fired as he fell, running from side to side by the edge of the sea. He wanted the enemy to think that there were more men here, so he moved and fired from as many places as he could. He picked up bullets that had been discarded by the retreating army, and he held them at bay. One man kept so many Germans pinned down like so many crows in a farmer's field. A rose grew where he died, and in later years poppies were placed on his gravestone. His mother and father were given a medal for their son, who was a hero who could barely grow a moustache.
It took a long time to get it, Harry. 'Twas a long time to grow. It took a long time to get it, Harry, for the toothbrush has to show. Goodbye, Charlie Chaplin. Farewell, tufts of hair. 'Twas a long, long time to get it, Harry. Now my upper lip's bare.
A piece of old Russia close to his heart. She had a great secret that she had locked inside of her heart. Not even her husband knew. No one knew. No one suspected that she was Russian. As a girl, some 10 years before, she had fled the oppression of the Tsars, with only a few small belongings to her name. Every night before she had left, she would listen to black shellac language records, and had practised speaking English like a true-born American, so that no one would know her true origins. That was all before war had been declared, before the Eastern Front on the borders of Russia had been turned into blood-soaked bitter battlefields. Her first language was Russian, and was only in her dreams that she would think and speak in her mother tongue, and she took the name of Natalie. Her looks were striking, small-framed with the sadness inside of her heart and eyes. It was this that had attracted the rich college graduate who was to be her husband. With her mixture of Russian vowels and parrot-fashioned learned attempts at English, she had developed a strong Bostonian accent. Many would not place exactly where she was from, and rather than slip from her disguise, she would ask them to guess where I am from in our great US of A. To keep from being discovered, she would always acquiesce to wherever they said. "I knew it! I knew it!" they would exclaim. "I knew you were from Wisconsin, Iowa, Kentucky." And they would always be happy with being told they were correct. She did not mind, just as long as they did not say, "You are from Minsk in Russia." Secretly, with a hand up to her mouth to cover her smile, she would congratulate herself on her great powers of mimicry. Perhaps this was what had attracted him to her, with a beautiful way of speaking to him, the way she kept looking at him, and a proud bearing. She had drawn him in like a fish upon a line. He was the favoured son of a rich family, and so in love with her that he never doubted or questioned where she was from. She did not choose an easy life. She was generous to a fault with her husband's blessing, and many, despite her charitable work, would say that she was too good for this world, with her kind deeds and manners. The war that had raged for 2 years in Europe seemed so far away to these Americans, but it was brought home to them with the sinking of the Lusitania. Then the talk was of who was going to join them from their families, friends and relations, sons, fathers, nephews, uncles and cousins. At least it seemed far away for them. For everyone else, she could not stop herself from listening to the radio and wince as the announcer mispronounced the names of towns and cities under siege, towns and cities that she had known as a girl. For her, there was no doubt that she would do just what she could to help, but she was shocked that her own husband had decided to join in the first wave of recruits. He had always kept himself active on the football fields at college, but this was a different game that she, and all of the women of America were asking their men to play. She felt so proud of him as he stood in their front parlour with the sound of a chiming golden clock on their mantelpiece. She had told him that she had bought it from a stall in a market in Ohio, but it was really a family heirloom from a grandmother, given to her so long ago in Mother Russia. She only had this and a golden chain and a silver locket as a memento of her native land. Outside, they could hear their 2 children playing with a red ball on the lawn that led to their house. He did look magnificent. In America, there was no shortage of material to make uniforms, and even before they had finished their basic training, the American Army made sure everyone had a full uniform. She reached up to kiss him and was about to say, "Be careful out there," but he placed his finger at her lips and said, I know. I want to be safe and come back and see the kids grow. Don't worry too much. I'll be careful." He was going to be one of the first to be shipped overseas, and she reached into her pocket and pulled out the chain and locket and placed it around his neck. Inside, it had a picture of them all together, standing smiling with the great Rocky Mountains behind them. It was framed in a piece of the red silk pillowcase that they had slept upon, to remind him to come back. As the sun clawed its way through the icy mist that had laid itself upon the town, the golden hands of the clock reached for the hour, and the clock chimed again. He snapped into action. Slinging his bag over his shoulder, he told her to "Kiss the kids for me. Tell them their father will be back." And he was gone. In wartime, many different people were thrown together, and it did not seem so unusual that such a rich, refined woman as her should be doing hard manual work in a factory, to help make tyres for trucks for the war, and she would dream of her husband's return. Every night she would leave a candle in the window to welcome him home, only to have to blow it out at dawn, when he had not returned. The years were tick-tocked away by that gold-framed clock in the front parlour. The room had been used as a barrack room for young soldiers ready for the war. The children had grown, and still she worked effortlessly for the war effort. When it came to the point where people had no food and were starving in Russia, the clock was taken down from its place and sent to a jeweller's to be melted down to help those soldiers and people so far away on the Eastern Front, so that they could have food to outlive this war. She loved the idea that something that she had saved from Russia was going to help Russia. The jeweller noticed that the writing inside of the clock was filled with inscriptions and Cyrillic letters dedicated to "My sweet Natalia." This was not something that you could get from a market stall in Ohio. Whispers spread and soon became rumours, and rumours became talk about how Natalie must have fled from Russia. She was given respect and gratitude for what she had done, and no one thought of her as being too good for the town. Of course, many would say, "I knew she was from Russia, I could tell." But that mostly came from those who had affirmed that she was from Iowa. One day she did come down, and the candle's flame had been blown out. Her husband had returned, like some silent thief in the night, and he had been wounded. She could tell by the battle stains and blood on his jacket. He'd been caught on the barbed wire, and it was only as he saw the picture in the locket that he had gained the strength to get himself to safety. And now he was safely home, and ready to settle down with his Russian wife.
Shine. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Last night in the pale moonlight we saw ya.
A head
we
filled with
saw
hate.
ya. You were mending your
Preparing for this new battle, he could not believe his luck. He had been given good food from a high-class restaurant here on the borders of Germany. He knew that this was a place that would never have let him in through the front door if he had not been a soldier. It had been a long, bitter battle, fighting against those people that he hated so much. Many of his comrades saw their service in the army as a job. It was something that they had to do, but he was filled with hate for all of the English. 2 years ago, when he was a boy soldier, he thought that the English would play fair and fight. It was the decent thing to do, to abide by rules of war and fight hard and with dignity. On that bleak, dark night, he'd been made to stand out of the deep trenches to make room for the stretcher-bearers to carry a wounded comrade. It was at that moment that the British launched their flare Vari-lights. They made it as bright as day and made him lose all sense of direction. He could not remain on the lip of the trench in the glare they gave to the night, and he could not return to the safety of the trenches. So he flung himself down into the dazzlingly lit desolation of no man's land and straight into the arms of an English patrol. When they had caught him, frightened and glare-blinded, they sneered at him. "You should have kept your head down. You're too small to waste a bullet on." These were the first words he had ever heard in English, and they were burned into his throat. Instead of killing him, they thought it would be a good joke to shave his head and push him back to his own side. They had not used a razor, but all 4 of them had held him down and stripped him of his hair. "That'll teach you a lesson. Keep your head down, boy." And they pushed him out into the darkness with an English bullet as a present. "There's something to remind you, boy, to keep to your own trench." He was a boy then. He was only a young man now, but he felt humiliated, not just by them, but by the rest of his company. He knew they whispered behind their hands and under their breath that maybe it would have been better if he had been shot. He had been mocked by corporals and majors alike for the way that his inaccurately, roughly shaved hair never really grew back. He felt as if he had lost face in front of his brother soldiers. He had done everything he could to get rid of his nickname, Glatzkopf, bald head. He had taken on more dangerous and daring missions in no man's land than anyone else in his squad. It was not just for bravery. It was on the chance that he might meet up once again with his tormentors and be able to teach them a lesson. The bullet he had been given as a memento was now on a golden chain at his neck, always ready to be used at a moment's notice. He was admired and mocked in equal parts for all of his headstrong bravery, but it did not bring him solace or happiness. And still he carried more supplies, ammunition, food and wounded comrades, with the name of Glatzkopf ringing in his ears. He became tougher. He ground at his teeth and would be ready to swear at anyone who even mentioned the word English in his presence. The 2 years since it had all happened had not tempered his anger. He remembered wanting to be known as a hero, someone who would fight well for the fatherland, someone who would be admired. He had joined with his brother, and they had been so full of hope and pride as they had placed the crisp, clean uniforms on their backs and had admired the way that they looked. 2 warriors with ideals of chivalry and honest fighting in their minds, ready to march to war. Now, all he had in his head and heart were murderous thoughts of getting revenge by any means possible. His brother had died a year ago, and had heard all of the name-calling, and had shared his shame. Now, it was the 21st of January 1918, his brother's birthday. Here it was not a time for celebrating, as the icy morning wrapped its fingers about him. He remembered times before this time, before the war, when the three of them would sit, his mother, his brother, and him, and enjoy whatever the day would bring. By the side of this cafe, he could see the reflection of his unevenly grown hair in the reflection of the silver tray that held the remnants of the fine food he had been given. The tray alone was worth so much that it would have kept him for a whole year, and he savoured the last morsels of food on his lips, teeth, and tongue. Without thinking about it, he slipped the tray inside of his jacket for protection against an English bullet, and as a remembrance for his brother. It would be enough to buy him a decent gravestone, so that he and his mother could mourn his loss. "What are they going to do to me? Shoot me as a thief?" And for the first time in a long time, he laughed at this wicked joke. In the trenches, the two sides were so close to one another that they could hear each other's movements. They could smell their meal times, hear their rare laughter, and their songs. It was then he heard it. "Keep your head down, Fritzy boy! Keep—" They were so proud of themselves singing their songs. It was them. He recognized their voices and their laughter. With all caution gone, he placed his head above the trench, and he could not believe his luck. Between the stumps and stubs of the bullet-wrecked trees, he could see them there. At the angle he was at, he knew that they could not see him, and he tore the bullet from his neck. The English bullet into a German rifle, and he took aim. He raised it high to his eye, and took a clear shot, and fired. It had never been part of his or his brother's training that different sides would use different sized bullets. A poppy grows by the side of that hotel, and in the doorway there is a photograph of a bald-headed young man eating the finest of foods in the worst of times on the border of Germany.
Keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Last night in the pale moonlight we saw ya, You were mending your broken wire, and we opened a rapid fire. If you want to see your mother and your fatherland, keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, 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 while you've a Lucifer to light your fag. Smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So
Unpacking all of his troubles. On a winter's afternoon that was so windy, she had watched her father going away from the edge of the city. He looked so proud as he kept time with all of the other men as they marched, laughed and sang their way out of all of the long rows of houses. With her mother beside her, they only returned to their own small house when they couldn't hear the men's voices. She was a little girl with a big smile, and before he had gone, she made sure that she had put the precious, the only family photograph of them all inside of his pack. This portrait of them had always held pride of place above the range in the front room. They had put their finest Sunday clothes on, and had posed in the photographer's studio, in front of his lavish furniture and a fine grandmother clock. Their house would never be as clean and full of beautiful things as that. Her smile grew wider as she thought of him finding it hidden in amongst his belongings. She didn't know when the war was going to end. Nobody did. But she wanted him to have a reminder of home, even if it was a pretend photographer's parlour. She knew, she hoped, that she would see him some day. She was sure of that, and she wanted him to be safe as he fought so bravely. 1 year later, on a cold January morning, there was a parcel, a real parcel, just for them, and it had a card attached. They had never had a parcel before, or a card. They had read it twice, 3 times, to make sure it was definitely for them. No one in the street could read it. Some people said that it had stamps that came from France. One thing was for certain, it was in foreign. Together, they carefully pulled back the stained brown paper, opened it, and read the card. They puzzled over just what Joyeux Noel could possibly mean, but there was no doubt about who it was from. Her father was not a one for writing. Numbers were what he was good at, as he would count and weigh out the sacks of coal to make sure everyone in their street had enough coal, and then some. He wanted to make sure that everyone would keep warm, but that was before the war had started. They read his scrawled writing, and it was a Christmas card signed, "With my love to my sweet wife and my darling daughter for Christmas." In the folds of all of the creased paper there was a present of a coat for his daughter, with a small note in one of the pockets. "Thanks for the photograph. Hope you like the coat. Thinking of you always, Dad." And there was a big cross at the end. What's your dad like? Thinking about us at Christmas, wasting his time and money getting us things, when he should be looking after himself. He's a good 'un, and no mistake. Her mother tried to keep a brave face on it, but Margaret could see that her mother was upset. "At least it shows that he's still all right if he could send us a card and a present." She held the coat against her skin, and she loved the way that it felt, and her mother knew that she was right. He must have been all right, at least when he sent this. It's taken the best part of a month to get here." Her father had seen the coat in the window of a fancy shop in France. He'd taken the photograph out of his pack and had looked at his little daughter, looked at the coat again, and had worked out that it would be the right size for her. With the card in her hand and the coat in her arms, snow was falling where she was, and snow was falling in a trench in France. She could not have felt any closer to her father. At one and the same time they wished upon an icy winter's morning star, and hoped, whispered, that they would see each other safe and soon. Some of her friends' fathers, brothers, uncles, cousins and friends had returned from the war, but they had been sent back wounded. There was some comfort in the fact that her dad was still out there. If he hadn't been sent back, then he must still be alive and not hurt. She loved that coat, the way that it felt, the way that it looked and smelt. Just knowing that it had been in her dad's hands as he had carefully bundled it up as he posted it to them was enough for her. Just knowing that he had looked at that family picture and had thought about them both made her smile and thank the heavens. She hoped that when he did have the time to look at the framed portrait, it would make him smile and wouldn't make him miss them all too much. She held that picture of a brave father marching away, laughing and smiling, and that made her feel stronger. Far away from them, he had a picture in his mind of his little daughter, Margaret, wearing the beautiful coat. As the time and the winters passed, she loved that coat, and it would always be there to remind her of her father. But the war had come to an end, not 6 weeks before, and still they had heard nothing. Many of the men were back with their loved ones, and yet her father was not back. Her mother told her to be strong and that their father would return someday. She reminded Margaret that it had taken the coat the best part of 2 months to get there, so he will just have to be patient. Telling someone to be patient and being patient are two different things, and she was gradually only dreaming of the worst. An empty chair by the side of the fire, and a row of medals that would never replace her father. One night, as she lay on her pillow, it was cold, it was dark, it was December of 1918. She could feel something being laid on her bed, a blanket, her father's army blanket, that he had used all of the way throughout the whole of the war to keep him warm. She knew that he was back. He laughed as he looked about her room and saw the coat that he had bought for his daughter when he had been in France. Well, it would have fitted that little girl in the picture. When he had sent it, she had to fit it onto a teddy, as it had always been too small. But she loved it all the more, because he had sent it to her, for her, thinking about her from the war in France.
Smile, smile, smile. From a day little Lancashire town, a boy had sailed away across the briny spray to toil in USA. When American girls gathered round and sought his company.
Everyone wanted to be his friend, not because he was kind and gentle, but because he was filled with a brutish energy that made you frightened to be his enemy. He was a fighter, a scrapper for whatever it was that he wanted. He had to fight for everything ever since being a child. In the Lancashire Mail, he was faster and better than anyone at cutting the threads, re-knotting them, and keeping the line of fabric moving. He would smile as he replaced the engraved knife back into his pocket with a satisfying click. The foreman, without his usual arguing, let him work on the machine that he wanted to work at. To be honest, it was easier than trying to confront him. He had even fought for the girl that he wanted to walk out with, even though she was filled with ideas about suffrage, about women having equal pay for equal jobs, even about women having the vote. He would never fight with a woman, and after that first stroll by the side of the murky canal, without saying a word, he had let her take his favourite machine. He might have been a brawler, and would fight a man for the dispute of a sixpence. This was a cause that he could understand, but he did not want to take part in this war. He could not see the sense or reason in taking part in a world at war that was like some petulant squabble between envious cousins, the king, the Kaiser, and the Tsar. This was the reason he had left his work, his home, and his sweetheart, to cross the ocean and find work in America. With only the blade in his pocket, he hoped for peace and no talk of the war. From the day that he arrived, when he spoke in his heavy Lancastrian accent, it drew attention to himself, and he did not like it. They would call him a coward for running away from his country, deserting when they needed able-bodied men. There was no work to be had in the mills, and anyway he would have to speak to someone, and that would only make him more noticeable to his fellow workers, and bring more questions about his bravery and ability to fight. He found himself a job as a lamplighter, getting up at dawn to extinguish the gas street lamps and trim the wicks with his trusted cotton knife. He would be out and busy at dusk, to light them all and never have to speak anyone. This was a job that he could do, gently whispering to himself and only speaking when absolutely necessary. Anyone who did meet him at the early morning or the late of night, he could ignore or grunt or shrug at them in the street, until they would avoid contact with him entirely. The only reminder he had of his old life as a cotton worker was the knife that he kept in his pocket. On this morning, the streets were deep with snow. He'd been all through this town by the side of the rich rolling river to extinguish all of the lamps. It was by the first dawning light that he saw the pictures of the recruiting posters beckoning Americans to join the war. He remembered how he had felt before he had left, and how it was not a cause that he could believe in. When he read about the sinking of that passenger ship with the loss of women and children, and that the Americans were not going to ignore this act of war, he could feel his fighting spirit rise inside of his soul. He heard a distant sound that was getting louder with each extinguished flame. The snow was being crushed by thousands of feet, marching feet, as the recruits were on their way to war. He stopped. He looked at them. Strong, proud men, just as determined as he was to right a wrong and be ready to fight for it. He had no friends, no family, no sweetheart, but something about the defenceless slaughter of innocent civilians made his heart and footsteps match these ranks of recruits. He followed them on the sidewalk. He threw down his lamplighter's taper and joined their ranks. This was a cause he could believe in. On an archived record of a roll call, some of his family, still living in Lancashire long after the war had ended, found his name listed as a soldier in the American Army. He had fought and died in a foreign field, surrounded by Americans, fighting and dying for something that he believed in.
Rarer than Sarah, my lass from Lancashire. She's a lassie from Lancashire, just a lassie from Lancashire. She's the lassie I love so dear, oh so dear. Though she dresses in clogs and shawl, she's the prettiest of them all. None could be fairer or rarer than Sarah, my lass from Lancashire. If you want to find the Sergeant Major, I know where he is, I know where he is, I know where he is. If you want to find the Sergeant Major, I know where he is. He's boozing up the private's room. I've seen him, boozing up the private's room. I've seen him, boozing up the
taste of
private's
rum.
room.
He'd been a farm boy all of his life, small, confident, and envious of the regimented lines of German soldiers he had seen marching past the end of the far field at the end of the farm. He felt as if he was doing his bit to protect his country from the invading English. Farm work had kept him strong and thin, but there was a yearning inside of his heart that made him want to see more of the world than these fields and barns. It was not just working for his father that kept him wiry. The food they grew, the animals that they took to slaughter, were all needed by the Kaiser's army, and they, even though they were surrounded by food, had very little to eat. His mother would tell him to have an egg. There are always eggs on a farm. Even in wartime there is never a shortage. There are always eggs. But he didn't want yet another. He wanted chicken, and to see the world like these soldiers. He was not the tallest boy in the world, but when he woke up in this hospital bed, he had to think, to try and remember how he had got here. One damp and drizzly evening after his work, he had seen the soldiers fighting by the brook that was a border to his farm. They were creeping and crawling in the water. He had played here so many times, throwing stones and rocks as a child, but this was no game of pretend soldiers. This was a deadly game. He could see the English grenade flying through the air. It fell to the ground like some flightless wounded bird. It looked like the grenades he had seen at the soldiers' belts. a long wooden handle with a large metal cylinder at the end about the size of a man's fist. He did not hesitate for a second. He flung it through the air. He threw it as far as he could, just as he had thrown rocks and stones when he was younger. But forgot to pull his head and body back into the ditch. Fascinated with this magnificent throw, he watched it fly again and set the world on fire. He had woken up here in this tent of a hospital, behind the enemy's lines. He was lying in a canvas cot beside row upon row of other wounded soldiers. It surprised him just how young they all looked. They had seen only a few more summers than he had, but he was like them because they were all covered in blood. As the grenade had soared and exploded through the air, it had torn through the bones, flesh, and sinews of his right arm. Lying, wounded in the water, he'd been picked up with a young rifleman who was lying in the next cot. They were both losing blood, and were being tended to by an orderly. There was no time to be hygienic. The sponge was dripping with their mingled blood, and this kindly medic felt as if there was an ocean of blood and muddy rain that just would not stop. There was a discussion between the doctor and the orderly as they looked at the young soldier and Peter. They shook their heads and placed a sheet over the private's face and started to furiously work on his arm. The boy could see shrapnel sticking out from his shoulder. As the war had broken out, all of the boys had collected any bits of metal that they could find and imagined that it had killed the English. Each piece was a treasure. They would brag and boast about how they would join the fight against the enemy when they were older, and then try to put the pieces together as if they were a jigsaw puzzle. But here they were, the enemy, doctors, surgeons, trying to save him as they bandaged his arm. Lying there, Peter wondered if he would ever be able to work on the farm again should this war ever end. He could think of how he would be treated by his father if he came back wounded. "So now you are a shirker, not a worker." He could imagine that his father had no time for anyone who did not pull their weight. He imagined how it would all have been different if he, the dead soldier beside him, if they had been in different places at different times, how their lives would have gone if they had not been wounded or dead. There was a commotion amongst all of the men in all of the beds. He could see a man, fit, tall, stiff, strong and straight, a thin moustache on his upper lip, and those who could turned their backs away from him, grumbling and muttering darkly into their pillows. "What's he doing here? He's always drunk on our rum. Always stealing our rum." Another desperate voice broke out. "What are you doing here? You never go over the top, you never fight." There was a general chatter of approval amongst them all. The sergeant major did not have to explain himself to any of them. He did not want them to be his friend. He just wanted them to do as they were told and act like soldiers. Whatever it was that they thought that they could say to him, and now that they were wounded, would not have made the slightest difference to him. He'd heard it all before. He had said it himself when he was a boy soldier in the Queen's army, when he had fought the Boers some 12 years before. All he needed them to do was to be soldiers, fighting men, and if hating him put some fire in their belly, then all the better. He knew that one day they'd understand that you don't always have to be in the firing line to help to win the war. There were always other things to do. Spotting the enemy, watching the movements of troops, making sure there were enough horses, men, ammunition, and just making sure that they did their jobs as fit fighting men. One of his jobs was to issue the men with a tot of rum every day. It softened the dreary reality of war. It gave them courage to fight. Every day this tot of rum had seemed less and less, and they would grumble into their tin mugs as he gave it out. "All right, my lovely boys, if you don't want it, there's plenty as do." One soldier had pointed his finger at the sergeant major. "You, for one, you're always taking it for yourself." This was not the way that you talked to a superior. it could get him court-martialed. The sergeant just looked at him, deep into his frightened eyes, raised an eyebrow and remembered what it was like to be under pressure at the front line, and smiled.
"Why don't I give you my ration as well, Sonny Jim? Maybe that will be enough."
The soldier was taken aback. He held out his mug, and the SM poured nothing into his mug.
"I ain't got no bleeding supplies stashed away. We ain't had a delivery from Fortnum and bleeding Masons in the past few days, so get it down, you. Stop your moaning. Put hairs on your chest and fire in your guts. Think about how you can steal some good German schnapps when we go over the top and teach the Boche a thing or two."
Now, the sergeant major bent down and noted the name of the dead soldier by Peter's side and spoke to the boy.
"So, Sonny, you thought that you would take it up as an army man, would you?"
His voice was loud and frightening, and Peter had no idea, no clue what he was saying to him, but he had a feeling for what he meant.
"Once we've treated you, I suppose we'll have to let you go."
The old soldier knelt down by his bed. These men had never seen him do anything kind. They had never heard him speak. It had always been the barking of orders and the enforcing of discipline. They gasped when he reached inside of his rain-soaked raincoat and pulled out a bottle and placed some rum on this boy's lips. He stood and resumed his gruff voice.
"You'll be treated. You'll be good. And don't let me see you here again."
The men realised, after all the time that they had thought that the sergeant had been stealing their rum, he'd been giving it to the wounded and dying in the field hospital, giving it to those who needed it the most. Every night the sound of the battles had raged, and within a few weeks the boy was stronger, fuller than he had ever been, and glad to know that he would be fit enough to work on the farm again. If nothing else, his bed was needed by a wounded enemy soldier. The sergeant major patted him on the head and gave him a khaki-coloured bag and his raincoat.
"That'll make a man of you."
The sergeant laughed and pointed him on his way out into the rain of a January dusk. The soldiers all said that it was a foolish thing to do, to release this boy back to the countryside. They would say, "He'll grow into a soldier, and he'll attack us when he's a man." The sergeant major stroked at his moustache and said,
"My fight ain't with children. And anyway, they said this bleeding war would be over by Christmas. Well, it wasn't, was it? I'll tell you this."
He stroked his lip again.
"This bleeding war ain't going to last much longer. Not at this rate. This is the last war that'll be like this swan. He'll never grow up to be a soldier."
In the time that he had been in the hospital, everything had changed. The fields were lakes of mud, and the path to his home had gone. The only way that Peter knew to get back home was by following the brook and entering the farm from the bottom field. He did not hear the bullet as it cracked through the air. He had a khaki coat and bag on his back. The young German boy soldier had seen the uniform creeping, dodging and crawling by the side of the winding water, and he had his orders to shoot to kill. All he saw was the uniform, and he did as his sergeant had told him. As he went over to view this kill, for a second he thought that this face was a little too young to be a soldier, but shrugged as he drank the rum from out of the bottle in the bag and smiled.
If you want to find the sergeant major, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the sergeant major, I know where he is. He's boozing up the private room. I've seen him, boozing up the private room. I've seen him boozing up the private room.
So many changes to forget. Everyone knew Constance as a pretty woman. She was a rich woman who had inherited her grandmother's impressive house in the heart of the village. To be honest, the whole of the village had expected her to marry him that warm autumn of 1914. Thomas Meeks was a good man, quiet, strong, thoughtful, and never wanted to do things on an impulse. When she found out that he was not intending to join the army, their marriage had been cancelled without a thought. She would not accept that he did not feel good enough or strong enough to be a fighting man, to be a soldier. He had wanted to know what was happening in Europe, why an archduke had been killed in the Balkans, and why the tinderbox had been lit across the world. Everyone else had war fever. He wanted to know what he would be letting himself in for before he joined up. He wanted to know the facts. Constance would not, could not accept this, and saw it as a sign of cowardice that was reflected by the mood of the whole village. The whole nation had risen to the challenge, and the walls of the barns, shops and houses were covered with posters beckoning men to join Kitchener's army, shaming them into joining because they would not be able to tell their children and grandchildren that they did not fight. She had been one of them that had labelled him a coward. Then, one day, he was gone. Like all of the other men, he was gone from out of the fields and factories. Now she felt guilty that she had forced him to go, the man that she had loved with every breath in her body. That was so many years ago, and everyone had heard the horrific stories of the trenches, and all he had asked for was the time to think about what he was letting himself in for. The war had spread from Europe to the English countryside, and when she heard that there was a shortage of food for the troops, she did not hesitate for a single heartbeat. She had her lands and lawns ploughed up, and worked like a farm to produce food for the soldiers. Her hands had become dirty, stained and ingrained with mud, and so strong, and she wondered if some of the food that she would produce would ever be eaten by him, the man she had loved for so long. In this beautiful small village, she did not know where he was or what had happened to him. There was never a card, letter, nor a word about how he was or where he was. One day, as she walked past the pub, she heard some returning wounded soldiers cursing a name that sounded like Week or Mick, but it was buried in the singing and the shouting. She could never have gone in by herself, not a woman alone, but she was desperate to hear what they had to say. Again, they cursed. "Bleeding Sergeant Major bleeding Mix, always at the front like he's got something to bleeding prove." Another voice chipped in. "He could have had a bleeding cushy trench. Oh no, not him. He had to go and fight, and all of us with him." The voices were joined in the condemnation. "Here's to Mick, Mick by name and never bleeding weak by nature." She heard the glasses clink in celebration, and the voices became lower, more thoughtful, and less filled with disgust. "He's to bleeding Sergeant Major Meeks. He might have made us work hard, but he was the best bleeding fighter this village has ever seen." They cheered. "To bleeding Meeks! May God damn him!" They all fell to laughing, and she had to move away. When she had heard them say, "He was the best," she could only think of him lying dead in a foreign field, and all because she had forced him to go. She had wasted so much time listening at the window of the pub that she knew she would have to hurry, as she had to help raise the crops of vegetables out of the late November soil. Hopefully, the sun, rising in the sky, had warmed it enough to make it easier, softer to dig. She had always been used to gardening, but this was not the dainty clipping of a few rose heads. This was hard manual work, digging in amongst the rocks that seemed to want to break her back and her will. She looked at her hands, once so soft, white as porcelain. They were cracked, chapped and bruised from all of the digging, carrying and planting. Resting on her spade, she remembered that at one time they would have used horses to plough and carry, but that was before the war had started, and they had been taken by the army. She knew, everyone knew, that this war was at an end 10 days before. But war or no war, people still needed to be fed, and so she needed to keep on digging whether she wanted to or not. She heard her spade scratch against something underground, and thought nothing of it. It could have been a stone, an old trowel, or a fork that was buried in the ground. Passing her, on the side of the path, he did not know what it was. He was one of the lucky ones. He was coming back to this village that he had known so well. As soon as he heard that metallic scraping sound, all of his training, his experience and reactions clicked into place, and he pushed it to one side. He grabbed this stone and threw it for all of his might, and laid his body over hers to protect her from the blast. The blast that never happened. For this was not the Somme or Passchendaele. He was home now. The war was over, and he was back in England. As he rolled away from her, she looked at him. A soldier, a stranger. Back straight, shoulders back, broad and at attention. A razor-sharp waxed moustache at his lip. There was a mess tin on the pack by his side, and she laughed when she thought that he must have eaten at one of the many food kitchens at the local train stations that she had supplied with vegetables. She spoke. "Is it you? You've changed." He looked at her. "Nowhere near as much as you have changed, ma'am. Constance." His voice was deeper, his shoulders broader, and he had a row of glittering medals on his chest from all of the places that he had been and fought. Looking at each other, they knew that they had so much to catch up with, so much to say and remember, but never to regret. He could see that she was looking at the medals, and he spoke. "I will take these and sell them. Once they are gone, we will never mention the war again." People thought that he was a fool to sell his precious medals, that others would and did die for, but they brought enough to make a fine wedding in the village. From that day the two of them would be side by side, digging into the ground of their garden, and smile if a stone would graze against a spade, and he would slowly, carefully, place it on a huge pile of stones that would mark their life of peace.
When this bloody war is over, no more soldiering for me. Oh, when I get me city clothes on, oh, how happy I shall be. No more church parades on Sunday, no more putting in for leave. I shall kiss the sergeant major. I'll miss him, I will